You won't believe what happened. The world woke up to the heartbreaking news. George Foreman, the boxing legend, the family man, the inspiration to millions, had passed away at the age of 76. But here's where it gets interesting. While fans around the world mourned, his family, the people who knew him best, were about to give him a farewell that no one saw coming. What started as a simple funeral turned into one of the most emotional and unforgettable tributes in sports history. Stay with me because this story is not just about loss, it's about legacy, faith, and the craziest part, the moment that left everyone speechless. George Foreman wasn't just a boxing champion, he was a symbol of resilience. A man who faced defeat, hardship, and still managed to come back stronger every time. His journey from a troubled youth to a world champion, then to a preacher, and later a businessman was nothing short of extraordinary. But in his final days, something unexpected happened. Despite his age, he still had that same fire, that same spirit, and no one thought the end would come so soon. Just days before his passing, he was surrounded by his family, sharing wisdom, laughter, and stories from his incredible life. But destiny took an unexpected turn. What seemed like another ordinary day became the moment that changed everything. His children, the ones who had always looked up to him as more than just a sports icon, were left devastated. But they knew their father well. He had always taught them that even in the darkest moments, there was a lesson to be learned. And so instead of just saying goodbye, they planned something bigger, something that would honor everything he stood for. His funeral wasn't just a farewell. It became a powerful celebration of his life, a moment that brought the world to tears. The tributes from his children were so heartfelt, so deeply personal, that even the strongest of men couldn't hold back their emotions. But let me tell you, this is where it gets truly emotional. One by one, his children stepped forward to share stories of the man behind the gloves. They spoke about the father who always had words of wisdom, who grilled burgers in the backyard, who never let them leave the house without a lesson about faith and hard work. But the most shocking part, his youngest son's speech. He revealed something that no one expected. One of the last things Foreman said before he passed. "It's not how you start, it's how you finish," his son recalled, his voice breaking. And that's exactly how Foreman lived his life. Every struggle, every setback, every comeback, it all led to this moment. And just when everyone thought they had seen the most emotional part, the real tribute began. The setting was perfect, a place that meant everything to Foreman. His church, the very place where he once stood, not as a fighter, but as a man of faith, preaching about redemption and purpose. The choir began to sing, filling the air with hymns that Foreman had loved. And then came the moment that no one could have prepared for. His daughters stood up and sang a hauntingly beautiful version of Amazing Grace, a song that carried so much meaning in Foreman's life. The room was silent. Some wept, others simply stood in awe, feeling the weight of the moment. But this is where the story takes another turn. Just as everyone thought the service had come to an end, something unexpected happened outside. Thousands of fans had gathered, standing in silence, waiting for one final moment. And then, as Foreman's casket was carried out, a powerful tradition in the boxing world took place. The final bell salute. Each chime of the bell echoed through the air, a reminder that while Foreman may have left this world, his spirit would never fade. But the most breathtaking moment was yet to come. Just as the last bell rang, hundreds of white doves were released into the sky, symbolizing his soul ascending to heaven. Gasps filled the air, some cried, others stood frozen, realizing they were witnessing something truly historic. As the doves disappeared into the sky, a hush fell over the crowd. It was as if the entire world had paused to honor the man who had once stood in the ring, fighting battles that went far beyond boxing. But the day was far from over. Foreman's family had one final tribute plan, something deeply personal, something that no one, not even the closest friends, had known about. His oldest son, George Foreman III, stepped forward. His hands were shaking, but his voice carried the weight of something important. "My father never just fought in the ring," he began. "He fought in life. He fought for us. He fought for his faith. And today, we're going to do something that would have made him proud." The crowd leaned in, curious, as he gestured toward the massive screen set up outside the church. "This," he continued, "is the George Foreman you didn't see." The screen flickered to life, and what played next left everyone speechless. It wasn't just a highlight reel of knockouts and championship wins. It was something far more raw, far more human. Clips of Foreman as a father, laughing as he played with his kids, footage of him training young fighters, giving them advice not just about boxing, but about life. There were home videos of him sitting by the fire, reading from the Bible, his deep voice filled with wisdom. Then came the final clip, a private recording, something no one outside his family had seen before. In the video, Foreman sat in his favorite chair, his massive hands resting on the arms as he spoke directly into the camera. His voice, though older, still carried that unmistakable strength. "If you're watching this," he said, "then I've gone home to be with the Lord. But don't cry for me. I had a good fight. I had a good life. And if you remember me for anything, let it be this: don't ever stop believing. Don't ever stop fighting. The real battle isn't in the ring. It's out there in life. So get up, keep moving forward, and always, always keep your faith." The moment the video ended, there wasn't a dry eye in the crowd. Even the toughest of men, fellow fighters, legends who had stood beside him in the ring, were seen wiping away tears. The silence was overwhelming, but it wasn't an empty silence. It was heavy with emotion, with respect, with the weight of what had just been shared. Then, as if on cue, a group of young boxers, kids from the very gym Foreman had built to help troubled youth, stepped forward. They each wore shirts with a single word printed across the front: believe. One by one, they walked up to Foreman's casket, each placing their gloves beside it. Some whispered words of thanks, others simply bowed their heads, but the message was clear. Foreman's legacy would not end here. It would live on in every young fighter he had inspired. And then came the final moment, the one that would be talked about for years. The doors of the church opened, and Foreman's family led the way to his final resting place. But this wasn't just any burial. This was a moment filled with deep meaning, with symbolism that sent chills down the spine. As his casket was lowered, a single pair of his boxing gloves, his most prized possession, was placed on top. It was a reminder that while the fight was over, the champion would never be forgotten. As the casket settled into the ground, the wind picked up slightly, rustling the trees surrounding the burial site. It was almost as if nature itself had paused to pay respect to the man who had once stood so tall, both in and out of the ring. The gathered crowd remained silent, watching, waiting. But then, something happened that no one had prepared for. A deep voice suddenly broke the stillness, carrying through the air with a quiet yet unshakable strength. It was one of Foreman's oldest friends, an opponent turned brother, Evander Holyfield. He stepped forward, his hands clasped together as he stared at the casket. His voice was rough with emotion, but every word he spoke carried weight. "You know," he began, his eyes scanning the crowd, "when we were in the ring, George wasn't just a fighter. He was a force. A man who didn't back down no matter how hard the hit. But outside the ring, he was something else entirely. He was a man who taught us all that strength wasn't just about throwing punches. It was about standing tall when life knocked you down. It was about faith, about love, about never giving up on yourself." There was a murmur of agreement among the crowd. Many of them had felt Foreman's impact firsthand. They weren't just here because he was a boxing legend. They were here because, in one way or another, he had changed their lives. Then, Holyfield did something unexpected. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, worn piece of paper. He unfolded it carefully, holding it as though it was something sacred. Years ago, George wrote this to me, he explained. It wasn't about boxing, it wasn't about fame. It was just him, speaking from the heart, and today I want to share it with you. He took a steady breath before reading. Life isn't about the fights you win. It's about the ones that test your heart. It's about getting up when the world tells you to stay down. It's about believing when no one else does. And in the end, it's not about what you achieve. It's about who you lift up along the way. That's the real victory. A hush fell over the crowd once more. Even those who had known Foreman for decades had never heard those words before. It was a glimpse into the mind of a man who has spent his life learning, growing, and giving. And in that moment, it felt as though he was still here, standing among them, reminding them of the lessons he had lived by. Then, without warning, the sky above them shifted. The sun, which had been hidden behind clouds for most of the ceremony, suddenly broke through, casting a golden glow over the burial site. A few people gasped softly, some raising their faces to the warmth. It was as if the heavens themselves had opened up to welcome their champion home. One by one, people stepped forward, leaving behind tokens of remembrance. Some placed small notes, others left pictures. A few old friends, men who had fought alongside and against him, placed championship medals beside his casket, a final sign of respect for the warrior who had stood among them. But then came the most unexpected tribute of all. A young boy, no older than 12, stepped forward. He was small, his frame thin, but his hands were wrapped in boxing tape, a clear sign that he had been training. His face was determined, but his voice trembled slightly as he spoke. "Mr. Foreman changed my life," he said. "I was lost. I didn't have a home. I didn't have anyone who believed in me. But he did. He gave me a place to train. He gave me hope. And I just wanted to say, I won't let him down." With that, the boy reached into his gym bag and pulled out an old, slightly worn pair of boxing gloves. They were small, meant for a child, but the moment he placed them beside Foreman's casket, it felt as though they carried the weight of something far greater. The crowd watched in silence, their hearts heavy yet full. This was George Foreman's legacy. Not the titles, not the trophies, but the lives he had touched, the people he had saved, the lessons he had left behind. And as the final words of prayer were spoken, a quiet understanding settled over everyone. The fight was over. The champion had gone home. But his spirit would never leave them. As the last of the mourners left the cemetery, a quiet stillness settled over the place. But for a few who remained, the weight of the moment still lingered. Among them was Foreman's eldest son, George Foreman III, standing by the grave with his hands clasped together. His father had always told him that grief was just love that had nowhere to go. But standing there staring at the fresh earth, he realized something. His father's love had never left. It was everywhere. In the lives he had changed, in the lessons he had taught, in the fights he had fought, not just inside the ring, but outside of it. As he turned to leave, he noticed an old man standing a short distance away, watching quietly. He recognized him immediately. It was Archie Moore's son, Billy. Archie had trained George when he was young, back when he was just a kid with fists full of fury and a heart full of fire. Billy stepped forward, offering a small nod of respect. "My father always said George was his greatest student," Billy said, his voice filled with quiet admiration. Not because of how hard he could hit, but because of how much he was willing to learn. George III smiled at that, looking down for a moment before nodding. "He never stopped learning," he said, "even when he was teaching." Billy let out a small chuckle. "That sounds like him." The two men shook hands, and Billy walked away, leaving George III standing alone for a moment longer. Then, with a deep breath, he turned and followed the others, knowing that his father's story was far from over. Meanwhile, across town, inside a small, dimly lit boxing gym, an old television played footage from Foreman's legendary fights. The gym owner, a man in his late 50s, with hands scarred from years of work, wiped his face with a towel before looking over at the young fighters who had gathered around the screen. "You see that?" he said, pointing at the TV. That right there, that's not just power. That's patience. That's discipline. That's a man who understood that boxing wasn't just about knocking someone out. It was about knowing when to strike, when to wait, when to believe in yourself, even when the world didn't. One of the young fighters, a teenage boy with bruised knuckles and a determined expression, watched the screen with wide eyes. "Coach, do you think anyone will ever fight like that again?" he asked. The old man smiled faintly. "No," he said, "because there'll never be another George Foreman." In a quiet neighborhood, an elderly woman sat on her porch, flipping through an old photo album. She had met Foreman once, years ago, at a charity event. She had been struggling, lost in her own battles, and he had taken the time to sit with her, to talk to her about faith, about second chances. She ran her fingers over the faded photograph of them together and whispered, "Thank you, George." And in another corner of the world, deep in the heart of Houston, inside the very church where Foreman had once preached, a group of people gathered in prayer. Some had come to mourn, others to celebrate, but all of them had been touched by his life in some way. A man stepped up to the pulpit, his voice strong yet filled with emotion. "George Foreman was more than a boxer," he said. He was a fighter for something greater. He fought for redemption. He fought for faith. He fought for all of us." A murmur of agreement spread through the church as the congregation bowed their heads. The legacy of George Foreman was not just in his punches, not just in his victories. It was in the lives he had changed, the lessons he had passed down, the belief that no matter how many times life knocked you down, you could always get back up. As the night settled over the city, a soft breeze moved through the streets, carrying with it the echoes of a legend. And somewhere, in the hearts of those he had left behind, George Foreman still stood tall. As the final handfuls of earth were gently placed over the casket, the crowd remained still, lingering as if unwilling to let go. The ceremony had ended, yet no one moved. It was as if they feared that leaving would mean truly accepting that George Foreman was gone. Suddenly, a deep voice spoke from the back of the gathering. It was Michael Moorer, the man who had once been on the receiving end of Foreman's historic comeback punch, the punch that had made Foreman the oldest heavyweight champion in history. Moorer, a man known for his pride and stoicism, stepped forward with a quiet intensity. "I used to think losing to George was the worst thing that ever happened to me," he admitted, his voice carrying over the hushed crowd. "But as time went on, I realized it was one of the best. That loss didn't just change my career, it changed me. Because George didn't just beat me in that ring. He taught me something. He taught me that failure isn't the end. That sometimes when life knocks you down, it's just preparing you to get back up stronger." Moorer paused, looking down at the grave, before shaking his head slightly, a small smile playing on his lips. He used to say that boxing was never about hurting people. It was about proving to yourself that you could take a hit and still stand. And he proved that, not just in the ring, but in life. A murmur of agreement spread through the crowd. George Foreman's story had never just been about boxing. It had been about resilience, about redemption, about faith. As the guests slowly began to move away from the gravesite, some heading towards their cars, others staying back to share memories, a quiet conversation took place between two men who had barely spoken in years, Larry Holmes and Muhammad Ali's brother, Rahman. Holmes, his hands in his pockets, exhaled slowly. "You know, we all fought each other back in the day," he said. "Me, George, Ali, we were warriors in that ring. But out here, right now, we're just men who shared something no one else could understand." Rahman nodded. Ali always had respect for George, even when they weren't on the best of terms. He used to say that George had the kind of strength that couldn't be broken, and looking at everything he built after boxing, I think he was right. Nearby, a group of younger fighters, many of whom had trained at Foreman's gym, stood in a small circle, their heads bowed slightly. They had never known the fighter George Foreman. They had only known the mentor, the preacher, the man who had given them a second chance when no one else had, One of them, a teenage girl with her hair tied back, whispered, "He always told me to fight for something bigger than myself." That's what he did, didn't he? An older fighter nodded. "Yeah," he said softly, "that's exactly what he did." As the last of the crowd began to disperse, the sun continued its slow descent, casting long shadows across the cemetery. But just before the final few guests left, something unexpected happened. A breeze rolled through the trees, rustling the leaves in a way that made them sound almost like whispers. And for those who still remained, it felt, just for a moment, as though George Foreman's presence hadn't left at all. As the days passed, the world continued to remember George Foreman, not just as a fighter, but as a symbol of resilience. His story lived on in conversations, in quiet reflections, in the echoes of his laughter still lingering in the hearts of those who knew him. But there was one place where his spirit felt especially alive: the gym where he had trained young fighters, where he had poured his wisdom into the next generation. On a warm evening, the gym was filled with the familiar sounds of gloves hitting punching bags, the rhythmic shuffle of feet on the mat, and the distant echoes of a jump rope whipping through the air. Among the young fighters was a boy no older than 13, his eyes filled with the same fire that once burned in Foreman's. He threw a punch, wild, unrefined, but filled with determination. His coach, an older man with graying hair and a knowing smile, stepped forward and steadied the boy's hands. "Slow down," the coach said. "Power isn't just about strength, it's about control." The boy looked up at him, sweat dripping from his forehead. "Like Foreman?" he asked. The coach grinned. "Exactly like Foreman." Across town, in a quiet home, Foreman's old friend, a preacher, sat in his study, writing his sermon for Sunday morning. He paused for a moment, looking at an old photo of himself and George standing side by side, smiling after a long day at church. He let out a soft chuckle. "You always knew how to teach without saying too much," he murmured. That Sunday, as he stepped onto the pulpit, he looked out at the congregation, seeing the faces of people Foreman had helped, people he had inspired. He took a deep breath and began, "The greatest fights are not won in the ring, but in the heart. And if George Foreman taught us anything, it's that the fight is never over until you decide to stop standing." In the corner of a small restaurant, a group of older men sat together, swapping stories about the past. One of them, a retired sports writer, leaned back in his chair, a nostalgic look in his eyes. "You know," he said, stirring his coffee, "I covered a lot of fighters in my time. But Foreman, he was different. He wasn't just about winning. He was about proving something to himself, to the world, and he did." The others nodded in agreement, raising their glasses in a quiet toast. And so the world moved on, but the echoes of George Foreman remained. In the laughter of an old friend remembering a story, in the determination of a young boxer lacing up his gloves, in the quiet faith of those who had been touched by his kindness. Legends never truly fade. They live on in the lessons they leave behind, in the lives they've touched, in the memories that refuse to be forgotten. Somewhere in a place beyond this world, George Foreman stood, not in a ring, not in a pulpit, but in the hearts of all those who had known his name. And in that place, he smiled. The fight had been won.